Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. Feel free to continue eating, drinking, or whatever. I got bad news for you. The book that Parag has written and brought some copies to this event is sold out. So Parag, it's all your fault. You should have brought twice as much, 3 times as much. Asian people are really intelligent people that like to read. So next time bring more, okay? It's all your fault, Parag. We'll forgive you. Anyway, just a couple of housekeeping things. I really encourage you to take up Alice's suggestion or offer earlier, and that is after this we'll open. Monday our exhibitions are closed, but today we'll open it for everybody. So for those of you who want to do it, just meet at the lobby, and then we'll have somebody take you up there. I assume, Alice, that you will have some experts to be docents to show them what's going on. About trees. A lot of you don't know this. Why is Hong Kong called the fragrant harbor, Xianggang? What's so xiang or fragrant about Hong Kong? Anybody know? Huh? Opium. Someone has imagination. Thank you. But that's not why. Anyone know the real reason? It's because of the agar wood. 沉香啊，沉香啊。And this campus happened to have some of the best agarwood trees in Hong Kong. In fact, one night, about 3-4 years ago, some thugs came here to try to cut down one of our agarwood trees. Good that our staff caught them. Anyway, so as you walk around, look at some of those trees, agarwood. It's really fragrant, and that's why it is called, Hong Kong is called agarwood, because in the old days it's full of it. And also, I want to ask everybody, we have not seen each other for some time because as reasons that Alice mentioned. We also have been doing in the last couple of years a lot of programs in the late afternoon, 5 p.m. And then some of you have reflected to me that our business and policy program have gone down. We have not. In terms of absolute numbers, we did as much and quality-wise just as good. However, we changed the format the last couple of years and did these 5 to 6:30 kind of program, or 5:30 to 7 o'clock programs instead of lunches. And lunches, of course, you pay a lot more, but you got a nice meal, and then you got a different environment. So how many of you really like to have more lunch program for business and policy? Can you raise your hand? Okay, those of you who prefer to have the 5:30 to 7 p.m. format, can you raise your hand? Okay, you know who wins. Okay, got you. Next point, I just started a consulting business, and that is how to get home from overseas. Last night, I flew into Shenzhen instead of Hong Kong airport, and thank God I got home at 2 a.m. in the morning. And I just learned from Kam Shing from JP Morgan that there's another way. One of her colleagues, went to Macau and took the ferry from Macau to Hong Kong airport and then got hopped on a plane. So there are many ways. If you need help, just talk to me afterwards. But anyway, we're delighted to have Parag here. Parag and I found ourselves sitting on a bus together in Switzerland one time. And he was a speaker, and as we chatted, I said, wow, this guy got some ideas. And that was when I started to want to invite Parag here. And he has been here a couple of times on various formats, but I think this is really a wonderful opportunity to have Parag being here to talk about his book. Recently, while I'm saying, why don't we welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Parag Khanna, Dr. Khanna, onto the stage. I wish I'm as tall and handsome and can jump up that like that. But anyway, Parag, I have 3 very good friends, and of which you are just one. And all 3 of them are extraordinarily talented and think beyond the box, outside of the box, and can really communicate, be it in writing or verbally. And the amazing thing is, a side point, is all 3 of them have an Indian origin. And I have a theory that, we all know, I go to India a lot. I love India. I go there 8 times a year. And they are really intelligent people. But somehow, when they meet the Chinese, be it in Singapore, which is a very Confucius society, or Hong Kong or somewhere, somehow it sparks something in your brain that make you even more productive and more ingenious in the way you think and the way you write.
Is it jealousy?
I don't know if it's jealousy. I like to think that it is really a combination of the two that somehow complement each other. And that's why I like to hang around with these guys with the hope that it works the other direction. That as the Chinese here are very smart. I'm just one of the few dumb ones. My hope is that by being with my Indian friends, or at least Indian extract
we
friends,
just slow you down.
I get a little bit smarter. But anyway, we're delighted that you have written this book. Seems that recently quite a few people have been coming onto this a similar type of topic. For example, Kishore Mahbubani, one of the three, by the way, is in Hong Kong. He's coming here tomorrow. And he wrote a book called Has the West Lost It? And then Chandra Nair, some of you know him. He's from Hong Kong, originally in Malaysia. He too has been onto this similar theme. So tell us, why do you think the future is Asian, not Asia, Asian? I don't know whether the N at the end has any particular meaning to it. And just tell us briefly, why do you think the future is Asian?
Thank you, Ronnie. Well, thank you all for being here under the stormy circumstances in multiple senses of the term. I'm very, very grateful to you, Ronnie, as always, and to the Asia Society for being such a delightful and warm, welcoming host. The Asia Society is such an incredible network, and as you know, I've launched this book in New York and in Mumbai and other Asia Society centers around the world. And so, you know, it really is a sanctuary, I think, intellectually. And now in times like this, one for dialogue, really. I think in given what's happening in this city right now, I think people are magnetically attracted to come here and to be here and to just be able to talk to each other. So I really am grateful to the Asia Society for that. Now, on this question of the future is Asian, it does seem like such a declarative statement, you know, with full of confidence. But what isn't printed on the cover of the book, sorry, I guess I shouldn't say that. This is the British edition. The American edition does not have the subtitle on the book, and it's a different subtitle anyway. The subtitle of the American edition is Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. So very often people will see this and they say, well, this is sort of just brimming with confidence, if not overconfidence, about Asia as an economic, demographic, and geopolitical force in the world. And they would be mistaken by neglecting that middle C word, conflict. And I think it's an important point to bring up right at the beginning, because I don't say that Asia is destined to succeed, that Asia is destined to dominate the world. In fact, as a student of international relations history, I'm reminded all the time that Asia is beset with about a dozen very significant legacy conflicts dating to colonial era, things like Kashmir, post-colonial settlements and the vagaries around them, such as what we're experiencing here, territorial disputes that may go back even to before pre-colonial times, Cold War disputes as well, like North Korea, frozen sorts of conflicts. But the test of whether or not the future is Asian, whether we live up to our potential, is how Asians go about resolving those conflicts. Because another area of study that's close to my heart and probably many others is post-colonial studies, right? The fate of the 75% of the world's countries, 150 countries in the world. Most of the countries in the world, most of the people in the world live in countries that were created around World War II or after World War II, right? And there are two kinds of post-colonial countries psychologically, in my point of view. Those that still blame the British and the French for their problems, and those that have graduated beyond it. And that's it. It's as simple as that. So when it comes to the conflicts that we're seeing around Asia today, we have to ask ourselves, what type of country, what type of society, or what pair of countries, what kind of diplomacy are we going to pursue? Are we going to blame the past and blame each other, or are we going to find our own solutions today to these problems. And only then, by resolving these conflicts, is Asia going to live up to its potential. So I wanted to highlight that at the outset. Now let me get into some of the good news about some of the fundamental points and hypotheses or arguments really underlying this book. And I've got a few helpful slides here. The first is demographic, and I'll run through these very, very quickly because I see what an incredible distinguished group this is. Not least Ronnie himself, and I want to make this as conversational as possible. The first is demographic. Now, we all know Asia has the majority of the world population. Here's what you may not be as aware of, but the world population is very, very rapidly plateauing, right? And the newest demographic forecasts don't put the total population highest and beyond 9.5 or even 10 billion people. So Asia is not only the demographic center of the world today, but it basically always will be for the rest of the future of mankind. And that's quite significant. Now, if you look at the world population under the age of 30, millennials, the top 10 young countries in the world with the youngest populations under their median age, all of them are also in Asia, with the exception of the United States and Brazil. So 8 out of 10. So not only is the past Asian, if you think about what we know about economic history, the future is very much Asian demographically and economically, but it's the present as well. So sort of think about this as a reminder of how special it is to be in this geography at this point in history and the future. Now, another motivation of mine was to look at the proper sequencing of the Asian economic miracle, because we live far too much in the present. Most books about Asia are entirely China-centric, and I've been guilty of writing some of those books. But what I wanted to do here was to accord to China the appropriate percentage by number of pages, if you will, that it genuinely merits based upon its demographics, economy, and so forth, and to put it in the right context. So you'll find that in this book, it's about 50% about China, not 98% about China. And that was really something that's very necessary, and I hope that will become apparent in the next few minutes. The first is to remember that, again, in the sequencing of the Asian economic miracle, it's a story that begins with Japan, right, first and foremost. And we all know this. But within 25 years of the end of World War II, Japan had already overtaken West Germany to be the world's second largest economy. And that's what I call the first wave of modern Asian growth. And that inspired the second wave, right? South Korea, Taiwan, you include in the tiger economies, Hong Kong and Singapore, saw the Japanese story and began to emulate it. So that's the first two waves of modern economic growth. And at this point in time, when we're talking about the late 1970s, we all know that China is still more or less dark, right? So China becomes the third wave, right? And it does so not in a virgin birth kind of way, right? So much of what has made China China is learning from and taking investment from the waves that came before it, after all, especially from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and again, emulating the story of Japan and South Korea. Now, for many people, this is where the story ends, right? To this day, especially if you're in Western societies, people look at Asia and all they see is China, right? They see it as the beginning and the end of the Asian story, and where China goes dictates everything for Asia. What they're missing is that now there's a fourth wave of growth, right? You had the first wave, the second wave of the tigers, the third wave being China, and now you have a fourth wave of Asian growth that I hope many people, even if you live in Hong Kong and have a very China-centric sort of profession, is very well underway already. And if you look at not just the 1.5 billion people of China, the 2.5 billion people who live from Pakistan through Indonesia and the Philippines, right? Most of these countries, all of them have a younger median age than China. Most of them are at this point growing at the same or faster rate than China, obviously because they're poorer. But rapid urbanization, right, and significant economic reforms that are being undertaken. And this is the fourth wave of growth. Now, the correct way to understand Asia as a mega regional economic system is not to think about it in terms of rival national blocs. And the trade war has colored our mindset about how economics works. We forget that it actually does function in these mutually reinforcing economic waves of cross-border investment, of technology transfer and skills flowing across borders and trade integration, creating a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's where Asia is going today, because of course, who are the largest trading partners of the countries you see in orange? Who are the largest investors in those countries, right? It's very much the waves that have come before it. What are the most significant, what are the countries where the most Belt and Road investment and so forth is going, right? So Asians investing in Asians, Asians learning from Asians is a proper interpretation of what's going on. So we are into this fourth wave, and Asia is indeed much bigger than just China. As I mentioned before, faster growth rates, in Southeast Asia now. I'll move on rather quickly. I want to point to a very key economic sort of factor that is helping to drive growth. One of the things that worries us when we look at emerging markets is that they are borrowing too much and potentially overinvesting, taking on too much debt, and so on. But a lot has changed in the present moment, where countries can borrow more in local currency, plan for the long term, and invest strongly while still keeping their debt levels down. So you can see on the sort of far right here, countries like Vietnam, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Here you have these South and Southeast Asian countries that are actually investing wisely, right? Strong economic growth, but keeping their debt levels manageable. And that's where you want to see emerging markets going. And there's such a difference today between how developing Asia, managing their economies, versus obviously the time of the financial crisis 20 years ago. When I travel around to all of these countries, it's a very different conversation. There's such more of a kind of pragmatic understanding of the need to privatize, to keep the current account balanced and so forth, and to undertake the reforms that are going to bring in foreign investment and so forth. And these were not conversations that were well managed or policy areas that were well managed. So there is now a big emphasis on Southeast Asia. We know that this is the third or fourth largest economic area in Asia, depending on how you measure it. With only 700 million people, you have a GDP that's larger than India's. You now have more greenfield foreign investment going into ASEAN than into China. For the sake of historical accuracy, when people write about the rise of ASEAN as an investment destination, 5-10 years from now, it's very important to remember that the story began before the trade war. It's very, convenient when people go on television today and say, look at how the trade war is diverting supply chains to Southeast Asia. Let's remember that Japan began significant diversion of FDI out of China into Southeast Asia 10 years ago. It did it as a result of not wanting to have too many eggs in one basket. There were geopolitical tensions over the rare earth mineral export ban that China had imposed. And they wanted to obviously focus on new markets and to develop those relationships strategically as well. There were many motivations, and many corporates began to follow suit at that time based on what Japan had initiated. So yes, Southeast Asia benefits from the trade war, but it's not because of the trade war primarily. And the integration efforts that Southeast Asian countries have been making are now quite real. And you can see it in all of the kind of diplomatic agreements that they have been forging with each other. Just to take stock now, globally, I want to get into a few kind of global macro factors and Asia's role in there. But if you measure economies in PPP terms, as you've probably been hearing out of some of the major financial research departments and their publications lately, Asia is effectively now 50% of global GDP in PPP terms. So the economics is catching up to the demographics, which is very significant. You'll also notice that here I've painted orange, the kind of Asian color, economies that we traditionally don't think of as sort of belonging to Asia, Russia, Turkey, the GCC economies. Now, these are countries that I've been looking at and writing about geopolitically for 15 plus years now. And if you look at Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, there was a time in recent memory where these countries were leaning west, wanted to join Western institutions, like Turkey with its EU membership. Now you can see with each of these countries, their trade has shifted more and more towards Asia. They've joined Belt and Road. In the case of Russia, they're very Belt and Road compliant. More and more investment deals with Asian economies, more diplomatic arrangements. You can see in the case of Turkey, them seriously considering applying for membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, if you have a NATO member applying for membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's when in Brussels, the sparks start to really fly. So, we're really starting to see, and obviously what you see with Saudi behavior in terms of the energy super cycle of the 1990s becoming much deeper set of financial relationships between sovereign wealth funds, private equity funds, and other types of institutional relationships between the GCC economies. You could see a petro RMB, for example, emerging in the coming years as well. So there's a lot to be said about how the Asian mega region comes together economically. Some of the factors, and I haven't, I'm trying not to bog you down with numbers, so I purposely removed. I want to talk about principles. I said that so much is different in Asian economic management over the last 20 years. And some of the things that are most strongly reinforcing my confidence in the kind of broader Asian economic trajectory relate to the ways in which consumption is playing out and reinforced by urbanization. The technological factors around digitization and financialization, expanding the orbit or the demographics of the consumer class, and including people of much lower per capita income levels than we would traditionally expect to be able to participate in the economy. I mentioned briefly earlier local currency liquidity, both for sovereigns and for corporates. And that's obviously been a very significant game changer, because in the past, of course, developing countries, emerging markets were so dependent on US dollar borrowing and interest rates that interest rates in the U.S. going up was very damaging, devastating, really. And now there's a much longer time horizon that countries have given local currency liquidity. And now capital account liberalization, which is a big theme for China this year. And again, China is doing what Japan and Korea have already done, and what China is now doing. Other developing countries like India, Indonesia, and others are going to say, wait a minute, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't our equities listed in MSCI? Why aren't we raising more capital internationally? So this copycat effect across the waves of Asian growth based on their development is a tried and true tradition, if you will, and it's going to extend into this area as well. So a lot of these phenomenon are underway, and I'm quite confident about them. Let me sort of dig deeper on one point that I think is extremely important, and you're seeing it play out today. This is a sort of correlation that I created based on looking at two factors: the median age of a country and its ranking in what's called the Economic Complexity Index. And that's something created by Harvard and MIT to look at the sophistication of an economy based on the complexity of its goods, the non-substitutability of the things it produces by another country. And you improve your ECI score by having a greater trade intensity or importing more capital and technology from your largest trading partners. So what you see on the upper right are what you'd expect. Japan, Korea in particular, have the highest ECI scores in the world, actually. These are some of the most technologically sophisticated economies. We know that. Middle of the pack is where you see the countries where, in fact, Japan and Korea are making the largest new investments, right? So you can think about Japanese automotive and industrial firms. You can think about Samsung out of Korea, and other firms are actually really significantly ramping up their investments in these second-tier countries that have younger ages. Now, if you're not an economist, I have a colloquial term for this. I call it adopt a country. Right. A rich and developed and aging country decides that it needs to, save costs on production, access new markets, build these strategic ties, and it decides that, okay, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, India, we're going all in. And that's what you're seeing playing out. And that will accelerate this sort of fourth wave of Asia's move up the value chain. Another anecdotal way of putting this. Has anyone, well, Ronnie, you were just in Bangkok, but you might have been groggy. When you get on and get off a plane in Bangkok, what's the first sign you see? It's in every terminal and every jetway. You can't have missed it. It says, "Welcome to the land of Industry 4.0." Now, Industry 4.0 is a German term, which is the country that ranks alongside Japan and Korea as one of the most complex economies in the world. So what is Thailand doing advertising itself as the land of Industry 4.0? It's precisely this. They're saying, we are a country that's ready to take in capital and to create the special economic zones and other sort of frameworks that are going to bring in higher value-added production. right? And that's what you see developing Asia doing. So I think this is another positive cycle that's underway. Couple of final points. The definition of Asia, I should have said this at the beginning, is not really in dispute by geographers. It's just our narrow horizon where Asia has been synonymous with just Greater China. The fact is that Asia is what's on this map, right? Russia is Asia, most of it. The Gulf countries are Asia, right? And if you look at what's happened in the last 30 years, and this is an interesting year to be having this conversation because the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So for the last 3 decades, Asian countries have been pragmatically resurrecting the Silk Roads, right? Expanding their internal trade, leveraging their complementarities. Think about how you have commodities producers, oil and gas producers, and energy importers, food importers. You have financially rich, technologically rich countries and those that are starved of those goods. And so you have this significant expansion. And what you see here today is today's data on bilateral trade volume pairs. And if you go back 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, every single one of these pairs has increased. And they're going to continue to as we have trade liberalization like RCEP and so forth kicking in, and countries realizing that you can within Asia achieve so many of your trade objectives. And so already Asia trades more internally than it does with the rest of the world. Last couple of points. Another reason to be optimistic, irrespective of what happens with the trade war, is that the developing Asian countries, certainly to say nothing of China, are not as dependent on manufactured-led, export-driven growth as they used to be. So this is not the Tiger era anymore. Even though most of the new marginal manufacturing work that's being created in the world is happening in Asia, our economies here, as you can see, are less dependent on it than before. More than 50% of the GDP of almost every Asian country is in services already today, right? So this is not the 1970s where it would be 75% manufacturing dependent or agriculture, right? Not even close. So even though all the manufacturing is still happening here, the fact is that it is now those forces of services economy that come from urbanization and digitization and financialization, that is the heart really of Asian economies today as well. So I'm pretty confident in the diversification that's going on as well. Last couple of points. When we talk about global governance and diplomacy, so often it's been a conversation about, well, why don't Asians lead in global diplomacy? Why don't Asians, have a greater voice in the IMF and World Bank? And what was missing all along, 20 years of those conversations about the future of global governance, was that Asians are probably more interested in building their own institutions than in, lobbying in a futile way for greater voice in New York and Washington and London and Geneva, right? And this is, to show you that, is a map of the membership of several different Asian diplomatic constellations. I've got the ASEAN Regional Forum, the RCEP trade agreement that I mentioned earlier, and on the left is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And for AIIB, I can't even fit all the countries that keep on joining. It's probably up to 100 now. It's striking. The brand value is quite strong. Iceland and Chile and countries that are not exactly contiguous to Asia, have joined the AIIB. So it shows that Asians are figuring out, how to govern their own region. And so there is now an Asia-centric diplomacy. And that is, what mirrors that is the interregional relations that are deepening across Eurasia. And so here, I wanted to, maybe you were going to ask this, Ronnie, and apologies if you're going to, but I get asked all the time, if you had 5 minutes with Donald Trump, what would you tell him? And I was like, I think he's more of a pictographic kind of guy. So here's what I would have shown. Just one slide out of my arsenal of 1 million PowerPoint slides, I would just show him this one. Because before launching a trade war, if I were in Washington, I would have wished I had this slide. Because this shows you that even though the US, as we all know, is still one of the world's largest economies, the largest economy, North America as a whole represents only 14% of global trade, right? Because it's the most autarkic region of the world, most self-sufficient. So one of the important things that people don't understand, by and large, is that just because you're a large economy doesn't mean that you are central to global trade, right? So the 14% is really a staggeringly low number. Now, it's great for North America to be self-sufficient, right? It's something to aspire to. But if you look at Europe and Asia, they represent a much larger share of global trade, and they share this region. And the one number that I would have wanted, Wilbur Ross and the whole gang to see, Peter Navarro and so forth, is that upper right number, $1.6 trillion, right? Europeans already trade more with Asia. Asia trades more with Europe, right, than it does with North America. Right. And so this explains so much of why European policy towards China, towards Asia, the US pulled out of TPP. The Europeans are saying, well, we want an FTA with Japan. We want to have the same thing with ASEAN, with India, right? We'll work with China on market economy, on access to Chinese market and so forth. But you can see a clear schism because Europeans all know this data, right? European leaders think in a very mercantile and economic way, whereas in the US, they're not as properly informed in their strategic thinking by the fundamental economics. And so this tells you a lot about how, given that the Belt and Road isn't fully built out, given that these FTAs that I was referring to don't even exist yet, if you already have $1.6 trillion across Eurasia, it's safe to say that'll be $2.5 trillion, right, in the coming decade. So there is a Eurasian story that's much bigger than the US-China trade war, and it so often gets ignored. So final couple points. This is a map that I made that kind of shows some of the major Belt and Road infrastructures, and I'll just say a word about this because it's very central to the book. But Belt and Road today is thought of as something that's a Chinese sort of hegemonic plot. But it began really as a defensive kind of measure because of the Malacca trap. I don't have a laser pointer, but here we go. Right behind Ronnie's head is the Straits of Malacca there. And for East Asian countries that depend on shipping commodities in and shipping goods out through the Strait of Malacca, that's an eternal dilemma. And Belt and Road began as a response to that, if you will. And in fact, it's something that really predates its own name. I mean, Belt and Road is a term that's only a few years old, but I wrote my first book about Chinese infrastructure in Central Asia, right? That was the majority of my first book. I didn't use the phrase Belt and Road, it didn't exist. But I'll be damned if there wasn't a lot of Chinese infrastructure activity in Central Asia. So the other thing is that looking ahead, even if we impute very nefarious intentions, let's say, to what China wants to do with it, it doesn't mean that it's going to play out in that way. Because what it has done is to unleash what I call the infrastructure arms race, and that's a big theme in what I'm, what I write about. Because now you have the Americans and Europeans and Japanese and Indians, everyone saying we're going to have our own infrastructure project. We're going to launch another financial institution to do more project finance. We're going to go head to head with China in all of these countries. To get the deals and the contracts. And so what happens is you eventually, if things go according to plan, you actually wind up diluting Chinese dominance over these economies, and you mitigate some of these debt traps, for example. And I think that's actually how Belt and Road will play out. A lot of people like to say all roads lead to China, but my answer is China builds lots of roads, but all roads don't lead to China. And that's in the proper spirit of the way the Silk Roads were. It's not just east-west in and out of China, it's north-south, and it's any two pair of countries. And you can see in the physical infrastructure that countries are increasingly building with respect to each other. Final point, I'm not a historian, but honestly, one of the most interesting aspects of the research for this book in particular for me was to just go back and see how this is not the first time in history that what is happening today happened. And historians have this term Afroeurasia. And if Belt and Road were not a Chinese term, but were really just a global observation, you would say, actually, what we're doing with Belt and Road is just recreating Afroeurasia. Because this was the 16th century world of the pre-colonial trading networks between Europe, Africa, and Asia, largely centered on the Indian Ocean, was the 16th century world. It was most of the world economy then was Afro-Eurasia. So to me, it's the rediscovery of the past, of these patterns that Asians actually were familiar with hundreds of years ago that we have forgotten today, that is recreating itself. And I think there's so much momentum and gravity to that we tend to discount. And so to me, even though I opened on a pessimistic note, saying that geopolitics can really derail some of the progress if we don't get that right, there is at the same time this almost inevitability about this resurrection of the pre-colonial Afro-Eurasian system that I think is very exciting. And that's a story that, again, is literally only 30 years old. Right, just 30 years old. The colonialism and the Cold War, 500 years of history, was an interruption of this Afro-Eurasian system. So to me, no matter what goes wrong, whether it's here or Kashmir or North Korea and so forth, there is a real deep sense that we are heading back to that world, and that's a beautiful thing. Thank you.
Very good. Well, we're great to have some African students here. Welcome. They're from Nigeria, right? Attended the best university here, Hong Kong UST. For those of you who missed our program we did recently on Eurasia, actually, was from, by Kent Calder, the Vice Dean of Science at Johns Hopkins. It was really a fantastic program. So make sure that you make sure your secretary or yourself look at the program that we have. A question here for you first. When you say Asia, as we all know, is really not that cohesive. Racially speaking, language-wise, culturally speaking, does it matter or does it matter?
It's a great question. So, the word Asia isn't even an Asian word, right? It's a Greek sort of import. So, even in Japan, there wasn't a word for Asia. It came, I think, I'm not Japanese, but I'm told it was Asia was, I think, I'm probably not saying it right. But so Asia is so vast, but I never make the claim that Asia is going to be, coherently, that it's going to be unified in the manner of supranationalism like the European Union. And a lot of people believe that that's what I mean or must mean in order for Asia to coherently matter. And that's not true. I go to great lengths to point out the diversity. This is the most diverse region of the planet. And it's always going to be that way. You have multiple, 6 or 7 major civilizational clusters and zones in Asia. But if you think about the previous eras of Silk Road history, Asians have been able to, despite the cultural differences and barriers to communication, been able to build such strong ties and complementary ties with each other without necessarily fearing each other. And I think that is what is happening again today. So, but is there what infrastructure and trade are doing is certainly giving a coherence to the geography that it has not had since, you might say, even the Mongol Empire, right? So it's been about 700 years since you could say that there is kind of a discernible, a pattern or framework, that is tying Asians together. And I do think that is happening.
Okay, couple of things. You really cover a lot of grounds. Let me just pick a couple of things to shoot at you first. Asia, politically, domestic political situation and social, very apt now that we're in Hong Kong. Is it that stable? Will that throw them back, not because of economic issues per se, but because of social and political issues? Does that worry you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there isn't one Asian political system, right? And one of the things that I always have to point out, and I think a lot of people in Asia ourselves forget this, is that more people live in democracies in Asia than the rest of the planet. Should I just repeat that? More
Please.
people live in democracies in Asia than people who live in democracies on the rest of the planet Earth.
That's because of India.
Right. Well, India, Indonesia, Philippines, you can, if you want to count Australia or not, doesn't matter. It's not that many people. Japan, South Korea, right? So, more than 2 billion people live in democracies in Asia. And it bothers me, of course, as a political scientist, and when you're in the US or Europe, people do want to generalize, right? Every other conversation or interview that I do in the US, it's like, Asia, it's that authoritarian despotism, and I say, wait, hold on, that's a bit unfair, and it's almost insulting, right, to someone, if you're Indian or Indonesian, to be thought of as just belonging to this kind of vague authoritarian sort of region. Right? So there is a dynamism, right, to democracy in Asia that's very, very important. So I actually spend a lot of time on this in the book, and I buried these slides in the back because I didn't think we'd have time for them. Well, you know what? It didn't actually render properly anyway, so never mind. I'll explain it. In Asia, what you have is, again, this juxtaposition or a spectrum of regimes, right, that range from the kind of, sort of democratic system that we think of like India, and of course authoritarian systems as we have elsewhere in the region like China. And in between, you have a lot of countries that are democratic, semi-democratic, that are really experimenting with how to have a voice or a growing role for the people, for citizens, but also not lose sight of the kind of long-term mission or mandate of modernization that you expect from a technocratic kind of regime, right? And that quest or mission, it's a constant sort of struggle, right? How can you be democratic and technocratic at the same time is at the heart of what I see many regimes pursuing today, right? And it plays out in terms of how strong is your civil service, for example. So even if you have frequent elections and changes of government, do you have continuity in terms of the executive branch functions? So I look at Singapore, for example, not as either because people like to characterize and mischaracterize Singapore in terms of what type of government it is. What matters more about Singapore than whether or not the elections matter is the civil service. And for anyone who's spent 2 minutes in Singapore, you know this, right? The civil service is the real engine, right, of any successful state. And even the most democratic countries in the world succeed not because they're democracies, it's because of the civil service and the institutions, right? I spent 6 months on sabbatical in Berlin a couple of years ago, and the entire time I was there was no functioning government because Merkel had to cobble together a coalition. There was no government. But Germany, alongside Singapore, Canada, and a few other countries, ranks at the very top of the quality of its civil service that keeps the state running, right? So that's the main thing to be looking at when it comes to Asia's political evolution. So when you ask, are countries going to be derailed not by the economic momentum but by political mistakes? What I did was to, as objectively as possible, I took what's called the Worldwide Governance Indicators. And it's a data set put together by economists at the World Bank. It looks at 36 different variables. One of them is free and fair democratic elections, but there's lots of other things like rule of law and independent judiciary and corruption and so forth. And what you can see objectively, these are Western metrics, by the way, not Asian ones, is that just about every single Asian country is improving in its governance quality score. Right? Even the places where we're worried about authoritarian populism and strongman rule, whether it's India or the Philippines, beneath the headlines,
or
China, beneath the headlines, those countries are doing one thing right, or one set of things right, which is they're improving their capacity for governance, way beyond where they were 10 years ago, let alone 15 or 20 years ago. So even
India included.
Even India. Well, India was very low. So, with India, a lot of things improve on a relative basis. It's not so difficult to achieve improvements.
How do the West look at this whole thing? Because let's face it, America, as you mentioned, is still the biggest economy in the world by far, militarily, technologically, university-wise, many things, and Europe is not too bad in that as well. So if they have a view about the rise of Asia, that's of concern.
No, I want to be absolutely clear. There is no common Western view, right? There is no common Western institution. I mean, one of the things I've been looking at for 15 years are the signals of the transatlantic rift and divorce. And I'm a child of transatlantic relations and upbringing between the US and Germany, and all the papers I wrote in high school and college, whichever side of the Atlantic I was on, was about Western civilization and the Western alliance and Western unity. And today, I think we all know there's very little of that to speak of. And so I go to great pains to, again, that one chart that I would show Trump is just one data point in a much broader conversation about how there is fundamentally a European approach to Asia and to itself, its own self-understanding, that is now quite decoupled from the United States, right? As a junior partner of a military alliance that doesn't really do much, yes, Europe is secondary, but that's not the issue that matters in most of the time, right? So the European approach to Iran, to Russia, to China, to trade, to technology, regulation, governance, welfare state, right, across the board is very, very different from the US. So we cannot speak, Ronnie, of a common West. We just have to abandon that for both of us, whatever generation we've grown up in, it's hard to let go of that, but it does not exist in a functional day-to-day way. So I look a lot at the European approach to Asia, and I see how different it is from the US approach. And the US, by not joining TPP, and so forth, is certainly diminishing its long-term influence in Asia. And obviously, as someone who's kind of looked at and been part of the operation of the American alliance system, my own time in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, there is no more, coherence there around American leadership of either the NATO alliance or the Pacific alliance system. If you look at each and every country, such as whether it's Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, every one of these is in a transactional mode right now, except Japan, where you'd say there's lots of transactional difficulties, but there's still a deep alliance, obviously.
Even in Australia?
With Australia, what you see is that the Prime Minister of Australia just said that he's not going to allow U.S. missiles to be stationed there. They have disputes over what the Darwin port can be used for. When it comes to the joint naval exercises, Australia has wanted to invite in China to be a participant. That's not something that went over very well in Washington, as you can imagine. So with every pair, with every alliance partner, there are these constant transactional negotiating difficulties that do call into question the extent to which this is an alliance in the formal sense that we would think of it when you think about the World War I and World War II dynamics, where we think of alliances as being these automatic partnerships, side by side. Well, the Koreans and Australians have been saying for 15 years, if there is a conflict, South China Sea or, East Asia, maritime or otherwise, we'll sit it out. We're happy to provide our good offices to help you mediate with China. They're not saying we are your allies standing shoulder to shoulder. That's for the last 15 years. It certainly hasn't changed since then.
So would you agree with the statement? I think this is important, partly also because I'm chairing a session this afternoon on U.S.-China relations, that the United States is really retreating to itself in some ways, even from Europe. And hence, Europe is going to play even more important role as far as Asia is concerned, both in terms of trade and technology and so forth. Would you agree with that?
I would say yes, that's fundamentally true in terms of a trajectory. But as I said before, the U.S. can afford to get away with a certain degree of retreat because of its economic self-sufficiency. That's not something that Europe can afford. So they can't make those mistakes, like what the U.S. is doing. Now, there are costs, as we know. Whether if you're a soybean farmer, you know this. If you're an exporter in general from this, in the energy sector as well, they're feeling this, from the poor decision making. Can the U.S. recover in the sense of going back to the previous policy? Yes, but it will have lost certain market share. Now, here's the thing that they don't understand in Washington. Geopolitical allies can be geoeconomic competitors. And that's what they don't get. When they look at the trade war, they're not understanding that Japan and South Korea and India and others are saying, if the U.S. doesn't join TPP, this is actually good for us, right? We're going to actually be able to compete on price. We're going to develop these longer-term relationships. There's uncertainty about what the regulatory framework is in terms of dealing with the U.S. And so the U.S.'s loss is others' gain, and we see this in Canadian and Japanese and Australian export data already, right? And so certain new relationships will get kindled or locked in that are going to partially exclude the U.S. And what you also see as a U.S. response is the corporate response. Let's remember that corporate America doesn't like this trade war, right? They don't like it at all. So it's not like there's one coherent American position. There's an administration position. It's opposed by a lot of corporate America. Now, corporate America certainly agrees that there's IP issues and theft that have to be dealt with. No one disagrees with that. And no one disagreed with that before the trade war began. But is the trade war the right way to resolve that dispute with China? The answer is not exactly, right? So what you see happening is that the substitution effect is going to play out. What China cannot get from the US in terms of sensitive components because of US export controls and so forth, it's going to accelerate the acquisition from countries like South Korea and Japan. And of course, it will accelerate Made in China 2025 to become more self-sufficient in those areas where it suffered a supply chain shock or disruption.
Just a question about India. India is a big country, 1.3 billion people. You know it very well, having been born there. Geographically, it's also very critical, both for the belt, the terrestrial belt, or the sea road or sea route. So what's going to happen to India?
So India
will they be part of this more and more?
It is. You can see that Modi is what was always talked about as a look east policy, but never really implemented. Now they call it Act East. So there is a stronger sense that India really does want to engage with Southeast Asia, with Japan, Indonesia, and so forth. And it's doing those things. From a geopolitical standpoint, what's very important is this set of countries called the Quad: United States, Australia, Japan, and India, right? So growing, maritime coordination, naval exercises, and those four naval powers helping to strengthen Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam so that they can stand up for themselves better in the South China Sea. So there's a very important role for India in that dynamic. In the Indian Ocean, there's a very important role. With Modi's re-election, the first couple of things he did
surprised a lot of people,
was to go to Sri Lanka and to the Maldives. Now, if you remember about 2 years ago, almost to be exact, people were talking about the Hambantota port default and the debt equity sort of swap that had to be negotiated with China as an example of how China was going to be setting up these neo-Ming extra, territorial kinds of protectorates across the Indian Ocean as far as Africa through debt trap diplomacy. Suddenly, with one flight from New Delhi to Colombo, all that changed, right? And what you're seeing happening is that India is now stepping up into the Indian Ocean space. You'll never have a pro-Chinese government in Sri Lanka or the Maldives ever again. So 2 years, a lot can change strategically. And India rightly looks back to its history as a maritime power rather than a terrestrial power, because its terrestrial relations have been much more about being invaded than invading, right? And of course, it's limited by its poor relations with Pakistan and so forth. But one last thing though, India, in terms of its military tensions with China, has become a case study in how countries stand up to China. Because 2 years ago, this month in July, you had the Doklam Plateau standoff. And that ended with China actually backing down to some degree from its road development activities at the tri-border region with Bhutan. So remember, militaries around the world are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, if we hold firm in a border dispute, if there is one, with China, we can actually potentially win because India dug in its heels. So I think there's, within limits, because India is strategically, always distracted and doesn't really have a global strategy per se, and that has costs, not having a real vision. But even just tactically, India is doing some of the right things.
My last question, then open to the audience, in particular with some students here. They always get a first crack. My last question is this. You talk about Asia population, 5 billion of the 7.5 or whatever in the world is in Asia, and or 8. Population is a boon and a bane. If you don't create enough jobs for these people, you're going to be really in trouble. Yeah. However, you mentioned that manufacturing is no longer necessarily the main thing. Now service industry is very big. Is it possible to sustain an economy just with service industries? I always say that even if the whole India takes care of 100% of the world's business, the back office functions, it's probably not capable of keeping up the 1.3 billion people population.
You're absolutely right. So, the darkest cloud, one of the dark clouds hanging over India is job creation, because they are falling way behind their annual target of 4 million plus jobs created every year. They're probably not net creating 1 million. And BPO, which you just mentioned, outsourcing, was creating anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million, in a primary and secondary auxiliary kind of way every year. That's dropped to zero. Net new BPO job creation, net, is zero in India because of automation, right, and AI, and you have to factor that in. So one of the concerns or critiques around the Asian development model is that we will suffer from this premature deindustrialization, right? In other words, that's a fancy way of saying the robots will take the jobs, and not enough, wages, income growth from manufacturing will not rise fast enough to cope with labor automation. But right now, what you see is that Asia and ASEAN is kind of in a sweet spot where you have again a lot of new manufacturing work coming in, and the rapid growth of services because of urbanization and financialization, digitization. So right now, Asia gets to have its cake and eat it too. But you can create a lot more new jobs and services if you spend correctly. I mean, look at where wages are for education, healthcare, construction. all of these sectors are where you want to see millions of new jobs created, because these are the things that Asians need to do for themselves the most. And if you just have a bit of a fiscal reallocation and open up these sectors more and privatize them, you're going to create a lot of jobs, right? So India is learning the hard way, belatedly, where it needs to reform the fastest in order to achieve this goal of being a services-driven economy. Because let's face it, even with Make in India, hashtag Make in India as it's called, they're not really going to create that many jobs in industry the way they would like to.
Questions? If not, I got plenty, okay? David Pong, right behind you.
David Pong, Shewing Steel. I've said it in other occasions, irrespective of what form of government, the number one priority is the well-being of the people. And China seemed to have delivered that. I cited the economy of India and China back in 1979, when China first opened up. They were about $500 billion. And last year, I think India was 2.7 trillion, and China was 10 point something trillion. America is 17, they're way, way ahead. And if you don't believe the statistics, you can see the construction, the development that they compare in China and in India. So perhaps there's another form of government which will bring prosperity to the people. How do we convince the other people that there is an alternative form of government and not bring the two into conflict? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I tried to get that earlier with this desire to blend democracy and technocracy, right? I mean, I think there is a playbook for developing Asian countries in terms of the things that they must do, irrespective of who wins an election. And so one of the things I've noticed, if you look at Asia's three largest democracies by population, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, right? And if you look at Jokowi, Duterte, and Modi, their campaign platforms and slogans, whether it was in Bahasa or Hindi, were pretty much identical. It was build, 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 right? Duterte calls it build, build, build. Or it's roads, it's electricity, and so forth, and job creation. That's how you get elected in Asia. And you basically, focus on that long-term set of essential development indicators that, and what you see is that no matter who wins an election in any of these countries, whether it's the last election cycle or the next two, they're pretty much going to be doing the same thing. Right? Because if you don't do those basics, if you don't deliver those basics, especially if you look at China, as everyone does, and say, how come they did that and we can't do that, right? And we don't want to give up our democracy, but we do want to develop and modernize. You have this consensus, a policy consensus. You don't have a political consensus because you keep on seeing changes in government, but can you have a policy consensus? And again, that's where I'm relatively optimistic. China does not have to preach or export or lecture other countries for them to realize that they need to make good on these promises, right? They are, just by looking at China, realizing that they need to do it.
Andrew Leung?
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for this insightful presentation. I read your book, by the way, from cover to cover, and I love it. But I just want to be the devil's advocate. Now, you mentioned this, your book's title, of course, The Future is Asia, and your definition of Asia covers, of course, China, but also Russia and also Middle East. If you look at, in terms of economy, in terms of size of population, of course, China dominates. In terms of geography, size of the territory, Russia dominates. And of course, there is the India, the Middle East, which is a powder keg. Now, in all these three areas, major countries, there are seeds of instability. I mean, China, Russia, and of course, Middle East. Not only are there seeds of instability, but they are hedging against one another in all the Asian countries. It's not, of course, they love to do business with China, but they're hedging against it. Even the relationship between China and Russia is not cast in stone. Now, coming back to the West, though, the United States is still a superpower. It dominates over the currency. The US dollar is supreme, and it's the world's most powerful military, and it's leading in technology. Why do you think that we are not in the next the future is not one with disruptions and upheaval, in which maybe there is, of course, a rising Asia, but of course the West, as it tries to re-examine itself and also reinvents itself, could we not see a dawn of Western civilization? So the future may not be just Asia.
So I welcome, an American renaissance and even a resurgence, same thing for Europe, because it's very consistent with my argument, which is that the world is multipolar, right? In fact, I always have to, and I guess, again, it works as a sales pitch, the title of the book, but it doesn't work as an accurate reflection of my fundamental beliefs, which is that this is actually the first time in human history where you have such a geographically distributed multipolar world, where North America is not going anywhere, Europe is not going anywhere, and Asia is rising. And even within Asia, it's multipolar, with China and India and Russia and Japan and so forth. So we have a distributed landscape of power, by any measure, the likes of which you've never had in history. And that does not allow itself, that fact, does not allow itself to be so oversimplified as, Asia wins, everyone else loses. Rise of the East, decline of the West. I don't believe that, and it's wrong for anyone to believe it because it's not true. But a lot of the things, for example, if you do have, if we stay on this course that we're on, it's one in which you just have more, if you will, spheres of influence, right? And Asia is already becoming a sphere of influence. If you look at the zones in between, what you call the Middle East, for me, it's the so-called Middle East, right? Because the term Middle East is actually irrelevant. It's not a geographical term. It's a referential term, right? It goes back to the British Empire, which is no longer exists. So, to me, most of it is West Asia, right? And as you can see from the maps, both the historical maps and the economic maps, it is West Asia. Right, and increasingly Gulf countries, see themselves as West Asia, and when I have sections of the book on Iran, on Iraq and Syria, you can already see that these are countries that more or less are taking the fresh business deals, the reconstruction contracts. It's all Chinese and Indian already in a place like Syria, right, and in Iraq. So you can have this switch, not of allegiance, but of kind of the ground reality happen very, very quickly. So yes, there are these disruptive kinds of, areas of instability, but, Indians aren't worried about a refugee crisis from Syria. Right. I mean, generally speaking, these are places that are looked at almost as areas of opportunity. Right. They're so destroyed that they're places that that you'll be selling things into as Asian Asian companies in the years ahead.
El Reyes is smart. He raises hands first, but student trumps you. So the student first, please. And then you, El.
Good afternoon. I'm Jesse from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I would like to ask two questions, but first I would like to say that I really appreciate on how you opened the talk. It's like that the geopolitical issues and situation in Asia, specifically in East Asia, can really make or break this Asian century kind of thing. That the East Asian countries have to resolve these issues first before Asia can really become the next big thing in the world. My two questions are, first one is, I want to put this in the context of the environment. I think there's a large worsening of the environmental situation in Asia, like air pollution, lessening of the arable lands for agriculture. Can this bog down the progress of Asia becoming a world leader? And also, do you think that soft power, especially coming from East Asian countries, has a role in Asia becoming the next big thing in the world?
It's a great question. So first on the environmental, this is really not what you would call a dark horse or something. It's really front and center already. You've heard that the Indonesian government is going to move its capital. I don't know if that'll actually happen, by the way. But that said, rising sea levels, in particular, given the share of the Asian population that lives in coastal cities, is a major problem, right? And so the trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment that has been taking place and is planned that is so coastal in nature has to be rethought, right? Otherwise, it will really be sunk costs in the worst sense of the term in the coming decades. So we need to do a better job of factoring in the environmental scenarios into fiscal policy, into kind of national economic planning across Asia. That is number one. So you're absolutely right. And even then, the only way to get around the volatility that emerges from natural disasters and these unpredictable events is to actually integrate further, right? Because you have, for example, the African swine flu that hit the pork industry in China. When you have situations like that, you have to have greater trade. ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is becoming one of the largest providers of food exports to the Gulf Arab countries, right, so the Indian Ocean food trade. It's a perfect example of the complementarities I was showing earlier. You've got the GCC countries exporting oil across the Indian Ocean, and you've got ASEAN countries sending food in the other direction, right? So resilience comes from building those relationships, especially for times of stress and disruption. So I think it's a great point. Your second question was about culture, and I spend a lot of time on that in the book. I was really actually trying to quantify, as hard as it is, the extent to which Asia is now more visible, kind of an influential presence. So I actually looked at Nobel Prizes in every field over the last 100 years, and how many of the winners have been Asian. That took a long time, actually tallying all that up. You see a growing presence there, so you can see it in sciences and literature and so forth. I looked at obviously, if you look at the American political landscape, the number of Asians that are prominent today, pop culture and so forth. You had this K-pop band, shows how old I am. I don't remember its name. The one that just performed on Saturday Night Live in the United States, BTS. There we go. So it's anecdotal, but I also looked at demographic flows. I've never seen so many Asians or Europeans studying Asian languages. Obviously, I've looked at the enrollment of the study abroad shift Asia has for some countries exporting students, Asia has become more popular than Europe. So Asian countries, particularly China, as a study abroad destination. So, there's 100 pages on this question in the book, and there's so many ways you could slice it up, but the answer to all of them is yes. Right, and this is why it gets to the geopolitical question raised earlier by Andrew. It's not about Asia replacing the West. It's just about Asia taking its rightful place. In whoever the kind of composite average human being is in the world, where how American you are and what role America plays in your life, and how European you are and what role Europe plays in your life. We're starting to be able, each of us, especially for Asian, but even if you live in Bolivia or you live in Albania, you're starting to be able to say, well, there's an Asian dimension to my life that wasn't there 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And you can start to think about that as part, even of your identity. And so I go into that a lot in the book.
Reyes?
Thank you very much, Parag. You alluded already to Turkey, potentially a NATO member that would potentially join the SCO. And you've also mentioned Russia. I'm wondering if you could go more deeply into these two important connector countries, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, of course, these are geographic bridges, right? And Russia, it's not a wholesale shift, because if you look at FDI flows, Germany and France still dominate in terms of their importance to Russia. But if you look at trade flows and add up Russia's trade, I had the chart earlier showing the arrows, Russia's trade with GCC, with India, China, Japan, South Korea, and so forth. ASEAN, Russia now trades much more with Asia than it does with Europe. Now, Europe is also moving towards energy self-sufficiency or independence, right? It wants to import less Russian energy. It wants to have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or at least Germany does. But they're also looking at Arctic, at renewables, North Africa, and so forth. So Russia, any way you slice it, Russia's future is much more Asian than it is European, other than the geography of its population, which is located more on the European side of the country. So that is why, again, if you look at the Peking University index of Belt and Road compliance, right? There are 99 metrics of how 100 countries stack up in terms of their, sort of fulfillment of Chinese desires on Belt and Road sort of technicalities. Russia ranks number 1. Right? Pretty much anything China wants Russia to do, Russia does. And by the way, starting tomorrow is the Eastern Economic Summit, right? That takes place in Vladivostok every year, where you see, I was actually looking at the program this morning, and you'd kind of be blown away. It's one of these geographies that we don't pay enough attention to. When we think of Northeast Asia, all we think of is the North Korea dilemma, right? But here you have, and really, you don't have time, but if you did, look through the program, you will see the Korean, the Japanese, the Russian, the Singaporean, all of these these voices and faces and figures and businesses that you've never heard of are all showing up and figuring out, how do you turn this Russian Far East, this resource-rich, depopulated zone, into a major hub of food production and other resource provision efficiently to the rest of Asia. And you've just had the first set of pipelines go directly from Russia to China rather than to the sea and so forth. So there's this whole infrastructural economic integration happening in that space. That's another example of how you have this kind of, Russia focusing as much on the East as on the West. Turkey's very volatile. I don't want to get too much into it, but you can see that Turkey's joined Belt and Road, AIIB. You can see in telecoms, rail, and other areas a growing kind of view towards strengthening ties with China and with India and so forth.
I told Putin one time that you are not spending enough time in Asia. I think I should introduce you to him. He should have listened to me. But anyway, last question.
Thank you very much, Parag. Very interesting. I'm the Consul General of Finland here, Johanna Karanko. I wanted to ask, if the future is Asian, what about the future of the future? Would that be African? I was just at the Finnish ambassador's annual meeting, and there the discussion was not concentrating really on Asia. There was, of course, talk about the trade war, but otherwise there was much more about Africa and then climate change, which one of the last questions was about. But what's your look on Africa? You said about the Asian African continent, but you didn't talk much about Africa. It's where the growth rates are the highest, the population growth is also the highest. Nigeria and other places, the middle class is really growing there. And of course, the Asian countries, China's been there a long time, investing, as well as India, more and more, open up embassies and so forth. So if you could say a few words.
A couple of things. First is that, I said that we live for the first time in this truly distributed multipolar system where every region and every continent matters, at the same time, not at the same degree. We have hierarchy in the world, right? The United States, China, and others still matter more than others, right? And Asia as a region matters more than other regions. But it is really the first time in history where South America and Africa are also players in the global system, not in a colonial way, but on their own, sort of in a voluntary way. And you can see that with Africa's relations with Asia, right? Again, this trans-Indian Ocean sort of trade and investment patterns over the last 20 years have been a key driver of Africa's growth. Remember that if we were having this conversation 15 years ago about Africa, people would be saying, until Europe reforms its agricultural policy and its agro-subsidies and curbs those agro-subsidies, Africa is going to be stymied in its development, right? Today, we're not saying that anymore, even though there's been no reform in European agricultural policy. I'm looking at you, Europeans, right? But the rise of Asia is the best thing that ever happened to post-colonial Africa, because it's a two-way street. You not only have the huge shift in exports across the Indian Ocean that's driven the growth rates in Africa, but you have the inward investment coming from Japan, from China, and from India today. That's helping to build the industries, the special economic zones, the infrastructure, the railways, a lot of that. So Africa is benefiting from Asia's rise. And you can see that in how Africans respond to the warnings from Washington, where they say, you're being caught in these Chinese debt traps, you be careful. And the Africans are saying, thank you, we know what we're doing, right? And some of them are definitely taking on too much debt. But the question that they have to ask themselves is, are we leveraging this new infrastructure in ways that help us grow and diversify our economies the way we need to? So that's a positive answer. But there's a negative side to what's happening in Africa that's almost exogenous, which is the climate issue, which is very negative for Africa. It's the fragmentation, which they haven't yet overcome politically. Now, there's talk of a continent-wide free trade zone. I actually had maps of this in the last book and looked at what they're trying to do with visa-free policy and more integration on investment promotion. In bits and pieces it's happening, especially in East Africa. But you can't generalize about Africa as a whole. It's very, very difficult to. So there's still the climate issue, the fragmentation issue. And then there's the question about the economic reform, because you will not have Africa become the world's factory floor. Because again, automation is this big disruption in the traditional flow or patterns of how you see manufacturing chase low wages. Wages don't matter anymore in manufacturing, right? So long before Africa becomes the factory floor of the world, robots will be doing all the manufacturing. So what Africa has to do is to get commodities right, urbanization and services right. And if it gets its commodities, its basic industries right, and manages to create higher wage, higher skilled urban jobs, then it can survive as a primary and tertiary kind of economy without the secondary industry in between. In other words, what India already is, right? Effectively, which is an agro and services economy. That's what Africa sort of needs to become and follow in many ways the sort of African, sort of Indian paradigm, if you will.
I'm going to eat my words. Sorry, the Finnish CG does not have the last word because a student from Nigeria raised his hand. So this is the last question, okay?
Okay. Thank you so much, Parag. I've learned so much from you today. I'm from UST, Mechanical and Aerospace Department. We can't but acknowledge the reliance of the dependence of most countries on Asian countries. We see tags like designed in California and assembled in China or Vietnam. But then, as it stands, we know that Asia produces for the West. I clearly don't think it's going to change anytime soon because of obvious reasons like it's going to be so costly if the West produces for Asia. And also there is this issue of the median age in most countries in Asia on the high rise, whereby we have an increase in elderly people more than the working age. Do you think that would have adverse effects on the future of Asia? Then my second question, you've partially answered it in your last reply. Do you think another continent might step up to produce for the world, say Africa? Because as it stands now, Africa there's been a very good growth rate in Africa. Nigeria, for example, I'm Nigerian. We are getting to pick up more skills in automation and other things. And I feel in the next future, we might actually stand up and produce for the world. What are your thoughts on this?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's focus, I guess, in the interest of time, just on your first question. It's very important about median age. A lot of people look at Asia, and again, just like they only see China, they also only see aging. You know, they look at Japan, they look at Korea, and they look at China, and they say, Asia's aging, you know, but it hasn't crossed the middle income trap by and large, therefore Asia is in trouble. So it's wrong on many counts, and I have a chart that I didn't put up today that kind of shows you the median age of every Asian country, but also the population size below the median age. And China, even though it's quote unquote aging, has more young people than any country in the world, right? Because the definition of median, right, is that equal number or below it as above it. So there's 700 million people in China below the age of 45. That's a lot of people, right? Now, India is very, very close in terms of the number of people below its median age, but it has a much younger median age, so it's even better in terms of young people. Now, why am I saying this? Because what's happening more and more in Asia, and this is very, very important for the future success of Asia, is that you are seeing a lot more population transfers, right? You are seeing a lot more of old Asia importing people from young Asia. Now, I mentioned that thing earlier about the complexity versus the median age. What you're seeing is that when a rich country adopts a poor country to help it develop, they also import people from that country to train them. So, for example, did you know that there are about 250,000 Vietnamese people in Japan today? Right? Not to mention 700 million Japanese from Korea or of Korean descent, and there's more than 1 million Chinese in Japan today. So Japan, the country that we think of as the most culturally insular, large country in the world, has never had 2 million foreigners in Japan. So you're seeing these revisions in immigration policy to take advantage of that demographic mismatch.